future for their countries, and how we can all get involved. And I'm going to just start with a couple of minutes to say a little bit about conservation optimism as a movement. So, first thing, this is my very first time with this thing, so let's see. You get onto, here we go. Yay, okay. So if you can join Slido using the hashtag optimism. Everyone's remembering that? I'm going to activate your poll. What does conservation optimism mean to you? And anyone virtual who's listening as well, you can answer as well. And we'll see where we go. Nice. So as we carry on looking at this word crowd, which has got an outright winner, I think, for me, as kind of founder of Conservation Optimism, it's about facing up to the huge challenges that we face in this world. It's about learning from our failures and celebrating and sharing our successes, big and small, as a community of conservationists, but also, beyond being a community of conservationists, it's about reaching out beyond conservation to people who work in other spheres so that we can bring in creative artists, we can bring in business, we can bring in everyone in their home lives so that everybody has a stake in our common future. We started this on Earth Day 2.5 years ago with our first Conservation Optimism Summit, and I know there's a few survivors of that. Hands up who was there. Thank you so much for coming back. And thank you to the new people who've come and joined us. And I felt like the summit last time had a really wonderful, informal, passionate feeling to it, where people were prepared to share and talk to everybody who was there. And I think we've got the same feeling here this time. But that was supposed to be a one-off. But then it was clear that afterwards, with comments that people made, the sharing on social media, that we had to keep going because it was filling this huge need that people felt to connect, to share their stories, to be empowered and supported by others, and to be part of a movement for change. And so we just felt that we had to keep it going, and here we are 2.5 years later, not just keeping it going, but expanding and growing and evolving based on what everyone's contributing. So now Conservation Optimism is an online community, it's an in-person community. We've got Conservation Now partners. I think we've got 50, mostly small NGOs from around the world who are part of the movement, part of the network, who are sharing each other's stories, who are learning from each other and connecting with people like them around the world to support them. And also with people who want to support them, who are not part of the conservation community. And we want to keep going with that. We want to create and support regional hubs so that we don't have to all come to England all the time. Convenience is for me. It's not so convenient for everybody else. And so we want to start having Conservation Optimism Summits around the world so that people can meet and share in person, because much as an online community is a wonderful thing, sitting next to someone at dinner is an even more wonderful thing, mostly. And then we want to provide some resources, networking, and support so that people can learn from each other and be empowered to amplify their voices and change the discourse. And then I think a real strand of what we've been talking about for the last few days is that no one should feel powerless to act, whether they're a professional conservationist or someone else. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce 5 people who, for me, exemplify conservation optimism, and I'm so honoured to introduce them. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about them. They can walk up. Come and sit up. So first of all, the one who's already there is Pelf. Come join us. Pelf Nyok, who's in Malaysia, and she's the co-founder. Oh, hang on. That's enough conservation optimism. Let's move on to this. Pelf.
Hi. Hello.
Chen Pelf is the co-founder of Turtle Conservation Society in Malaysia. She does community-based and schools-based conservation in Malaysia. She's also the vice president of the Society for Conservation Biology, which is a big global network of conservationists for Malaysia. And she was also the vice chair of the local organising committee for the International Congress on Conservation Biology, which just happened in Malaysia. She, like all our others you'll see, is a hugely active conservationist, and again, someone who wears multiple hats and inspires many people. I'm next going to go to the far end, which is Caleb Ofori-Boateng, who did his PhD on herpetology at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. He was the first person to get a PhD on herpetology in Ghana. He's now the director of Herp Conservation in Ghana. He's a Future for Nature Fellow. He's a winner of the Whitney Foundation for Nature Award. He's a research scientist at the Forest Research Institute in Ghana. So another person who's just inspiring people in many, many ways, internationally and in his own country. The next person is Munib Khanyari, who is my PhD student. I'm so proud. So he's doing his PhD, actually funded in Bristol, but based here sometimes. He's also a research scientist at the Nature Conservation Foundation in India. He's also a National Geographic explorer, and we're so lucky that he's actually sitting in a seat here and not up a mountain, which is where he likes to be. Elliot Newton is the creative director of A Focus on Nature, which empowers youth from 16 to 30 years old in the UK, young conservationist. He's the head of conservation at Citizen Zoo. He's the founder of Kingston Biodiversity Network, which is a local biodiversity network for citizens of Kingston-on-Thames, which is a suburb of London. So another person who's doing all sorts of things at the local to the international level. And then finally, Olya Esipova, who I've known since she was 8, sorry, and is the kind of power behind the community engagement of the Saiga Conservation Alliance in Uzbekistan. So she does a lot of community engagement globally and locally for the Saiga Conservation Alliance, my favourite species. She's an emerging conservation leader. She is also doing a psychology degree at the University of New York in Prague, so she's getting a foundation in something that's so important for conservation in the future. So here's our 5 amazing panellists. So they're going to talk to us about how they're going to take conservation optimism forward in their countries and globally, and some of the challenges that they face. And I want to start a little warm-up, and I'd ask them to tell a really short story about how they first got inspired about nature, and I think I'll start with Caleb at the end.
Well, I would say that it really wasn't an event per se. It was really my life. I had the privilege of growing up in a national park. So seeing hippopotamus and elephants and baboons were a fun thing we had every day. So it was more of my life rather than an event. But there was a few moments that made me know that I was called to do this, so to speak. And that moment was when my father brought a monkey, 2 monkeys into our house, rescued for the hands of poachers. And these monkeys stayed with us for a very long time, but they became very notorious and were causing too many problems in the community, chasing the women for their granules and hitting them down. And my father got really fed up with them, so he drove them several kilometers and left them in the wild. 3 days later, only one of them made it to town. And it was very hungry and weak. The small one, the baby, apparently couldn't make it. My father was busy in a meeting, and this poor monkey scratched my father at the heel and was so weak and frail. And we were very sad because we wondered what really happened to this other little monkey. Was it eaten? Did it die? I mean, what happened? And really felt very concerned for this monkey. And at that moment, I began to realize that I wasn't just here to enjoy the wildlife, but I was here to take care of their well-being. Thank you.
So I guess mine is a bit of a cliche one, but so I'm from Kashmir in India, which is in the north, up in the mountains, and I was born there and I grew up there, but when I was about 10, 11 years old, we had to shift to Mumbai because of the situation in Kashmir. It was just not politically stable and studies were not really a thing, so we went to Mumbai, which is a big city. And my mom keeps telling me now, I guess I don't remember it back then, that I was quite rebellious when we went to Mumbai. You know, I just wasn't settling in, and it was not 1 year, but for a couple of years, 3 years, you know, it was just like not feeling my own in Mumbai. And only 3 years after we shifted to Mumbai did we go back to Kashmir for summer holidays, because it allowed us, I mean, the situation was a little calmer to go back. And I remember very distinctly, I think I was 13 or 14 then, my dad and I went up, this is one of those Lion King kind of things, right? My dad and I went up, honestly, this is not made up. So my dad and I went up for a trek in the mountains. We live very close to the mountains, and then my dad very sort of, you know, sad voice said, you know, through the years of conflict, Kashmir, more than losing anything else, is losing what you see in front of you. And this is who you are, and if you really want to be Kashmiri, think about that as you grow up. And I think at that moment, what I really thought to myself is, yeah, this is who I am. I need to come back to understand, you know, the nature, the area, because I didn't know who I was, and I still feel I'm figuring that out. But I think that moment for me was like, these mountains, this landscape is I guess who I am, and it's that journey I guess began then.
Let's go to Pelf now.
Excuse me for my lack of facial expression, because I really cannot hear anybody say anything. It's just echo. Okay, so I've always been interested in turtles since I was young, and I've always had this affinity towards turtles, but of course I didn't realize it until I went to university. And in the past 16 years of doing turtle conservation and turtle research, I agree with what Albert Einstein said. Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to take action. So here am I.
Okay, great.
So I was brought up in London. I didn't have elephants or mountains, unfortunately. But what I did have, at a very young age, I definitely did have a passion for wildlife. And my earliest memories are just squashing my face against my window, just looking into the garden that we had. And I think my first word my mum tells you actually was garden, because I was always staring at it. My mum was like, garden, that's a garden. So I don't believe it was my first word, but that's what she says it was. But I remember just long summer days, just lying on the grass, just looking up and seeing bats fly above me and just being absolutely amazed by it. And at the end of my road, there was a little neglected nature reserve that nobody really knew about, but I would go there as a young age and just like run around and climb the trees and play around and just like look for bugs and stuff, and it really did really curdle my sort of thirst for like learning and just being out there. And I think what is nice now, because that nature reserve was really neglected, and one of the first things I did when I sort of managed to get into the conservation sort of sector was restore this nature reserve. So that is now is now a thriving little nature reserve, and loads of people use it. We have now like forest schools, and loads of kids go. All the schools used to go use it for education stuff. There's a lovely friends group and stuff. But yeah, it was very much focally based around my home, and yeah, I loved it growing up.
Wow, great stories. Well, I was a very boring kid, that's what I can tell. But I was lucky enough to have really, really cool parents. Both of them are biologists, and so they traveled a lot in many, many amazing places. And sometimes they would go to mountains or deserts, and for me it was very weird, because I would be like, wow, like why do you need to go somewhere for days and days by car in order to switch to, I don't know, ride horses in order to get to the highest mountains and then set up a tent and sleep there for a few weeks without shower, without beds, and this kind of stuff. Like, why? You have a flat, for God's sake. And so that was my mindset, and the truth is I just didn't have any friends or relatives or anyone who I would know who would also be doing something related to conservation or biology. And so that's why it was very weird for me, and my dream was to become like a, I don't know, business person or like work in the office and stuff like that, which at the time seemed very cool. Yes, but then one day my parents just took me with them on a trip, and God knows I didn't want to go. I really didn't want. But they made me go, and so I don't know what happened exactly, but I just remember one time I look out of the window and what I see looks something like a surface of the moon. We went to the desert, and it was so strange. Like there was almost nothing, and it was a sunset time, and you could almost see the stars, but not quite yet. And the land was kind of cracked and very dry, and there were some saigas on the horizons. That was so magical, and so it changed my mind. It totally blew my mind. And so I don't know what exactly it was. Maybe just me being there, or seeing the animals in the wild, or just hanging around with people who were doing such amazing things. But by the time I got back, I was not the same kid anymore. So that's how my story began.
Okay, so now this is something I'm going to ask the panellists, but I'm also going to ask you lot through your Slido about what has inspired, interested you over the last couple of days of this summit. What are you going to take away from here and act upon? And hopefully it will work, and Pelf will still be with us. Let's have a go.
Well, I can go, I guess.
Hang on. This is my first time. Here we go. Go. Olya, go for it.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about positivity in general, and all the great emotions, and that's amazing to talk about that and not to pay that much attention to all the negativity that is circling around the topic of conservation. But I guess the takeaway for me was that you shouldn't be caught up in either too much positivity or negativity, because neither helps. And even though there are so many great things you can be proud of, or so many things that you can be passionate about, sometimes it makes it harder for you to make a good decision or a relevant decision that would be worthwhile in terms of like the strategy that you use, the messaging that you use, the kind of people you try to apply to. Or oftentimes when we are so enthusiastic, we can overestimate our skills and the resources that we have. And it sounds very pessimistic right now, because basically I'm saying that good emotions are not that good, which I don't mean, but I guess it's good to be able to disengage sometimes, but yet bear in mind that you have both sides, not only negative but the positive ones as well. And if you can disengage a little bit and then still remember about all the good stuff, that will motivate you a lot. And I guess so the takeaway for me is that try to be reasonable, remember about the good things, and don't be caught up in all the negativity.
Brilliant. Let's flip to the end of Caleb.
Okay, so am I screaming too much? Yeah, so I've really learned a lot. It's very difficult to say this or that, but I'm really inspired by the many amphibian projects that are succeeding, surprisingly. And that really inspires me to know that we would continue to succeed. I also learned something very important from the failure workshop, which makes me think that, it's a reason for failure sometimes, that it comes to help us to learn and to be better and to to do better, to face the challenges ahead in a better way. So it's a very optimistic way of looking at the challenges that I face on a daily basis, inspired. And the last thing that I definitely I'm going home with is also on the plenary by Laurie Palmer. I think it's very revolutionary for me. Thank you.
Munib.
I guess one of the things that I definitely will take away from this summit is the power of creativity. I mean, there were so many different sessions that use that, as a center point, and that's quite empowering, because that sort of, in a way, tells you that you can choose, have freedom in the way you express, be it your concerns, be it your realities, be it your solutions. And I think that freedom is something that I learned, and I think I want to see how I can apply that in my life and my work. So yeah, creativity.
Elliot.
I think there have been so many amazing talks and workshops and stuff, but I think actually one of my favourite parts and one of my biggest take-homes from this conference has been the breaks. And bear with me, just the diverse and sheer amazing people that are in this room and audience, and just talking to everybody with their amazing positive stories, and just getting to know you and just to hear that really has been inspirational for me. And I just think it's not just the diversity within the conservation sector that we've got here, but also there's people here that aren't typically from the conservation sector. I've been talking to people who don't actually work in the conservation sector at all, and yet they've been drawn here and hopefully going to learn lessons from this conference and take it into their other elements of their life. So that, to me, has been one of the most positive things.
Lovely. Pelf, did you hear any of that?
No, echo.
Sorry, I think we've still got slight technical issues, but here's one that I'm going to start with you, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so people are always talking about, and probably need to, future conservation leaders. Seems a bit patronising to me, sorry. Because your examples of younger people who are providing leadership now, and I was a bit depressed actually, Alice, if you're around. Early 40s is not old, okay? Just saying. Anyway, still, young people do seem to be a bit marginalised from decision-making that really matters for nature. So, do you have any ideas as to how to change that marginalisation, Pelf?
Well, I think we have to look at both sides of the coin I should not use the word older people, more experienced conservation leaders should give younger people a chance to take part in the decision-making process, because it is not something you get to learn how to do overnight. So it is a lot of steps involved, and it would be nice to see more leaders engaging younger people in these processes. But on the other side of the coin, I feel that younger people should be more passionate about the work they're doing, because if you're not passionate about it, it shows on your face, so you're not going anywhere. That's my take.
Great, thank you. Oh yeah.
For me, it seems that we should understand the reason why it happens first in order to do something, and basically for me it boils down to three main things, and these are culture, exposure, and insecurities. So culture, as in the sense that it depends so much on what kind of environment you've been growing with, because in my country, in Uzbekistan, for example, we have a really strict hierarchical rules when it comes to age, because the older people are more respected and so they're more trusted, whereas younger people are not. And this is something that's been going on for generations, so it's just something that you see around. And it's linked to exposure, because if the only example that you see around yourself is that older people are being treated as though they know everything, and indeed maybe they know a lot more on different topics, but then you don't see that much representation of young people in decision making, well, you just don't expect to see a young person doing something like that. So you're not used to the idea. So the idea seems very strange to you, and you are not likely to trust young people that much, maybe. Well, and the third thing is our insecurities, because even though we all want to seem nice and maybe we want to achieve something great and all, but People tend to compare ourselves, like we tend to compare ourselves to others. And even though we all hear the idea that we should compare ourselves only to the old version of ourselves, well, for good or for worse, we compare ourselves to other people from time to time. And so sometimes this comparison seems not very positive, like when a younger person achieved something that, I don't know, maybe took someone years and years to build on, and you may feel that it's kind of frustrating, because again, this person is probably smarter and maybe better looking or whatnot. But the truth is, well, there's always someone who is smarter than you, who is more better looking than you, who is younger than you, and yes, that's the reality. So I think we should just get over that mentality and work on our mindset to accept that young people also have a right to say some things, and we can trust them. They are not always right. We should not give young people credits just because they are young, and yet we shouldn't give credits to older people just because they are more experienced, because again, it's not always the same thing. So I guess working on our mentality and exposing ourselves to different crowds would help a lot.
Great. I'm going to skip to Munib.
Sure. So when I think about this, I'm sort of reminded of an analogy, and if I may, I'll use it. So when I was in school, I used to play a lot of football, and our coach kept on telling us, when you have the football with you is when you can do things. I mean, there's many philosophies, I guess, but that was one of them. And he said, think about this going ahead, both in your game and your life. And honestly, when I think about this question, the first answer that honestly comes to my mind is that it's absolutely multifactorial, right? Like, I'm a PhD student at the end of the day, so that's the first thing you think of. But then, when I actually disentangle it, I feel like I would turn and point at myself and ask myself, can we as the youth do more, right? I mean, for sure there's a lot outside that can change, but I ask myself and the youth, however you may define that, like, can we do more to engage? Within the existing system, can we speak out more? Like Alice was talking about, the youth coming out and protesting or whatever it is. Like, can we still do more? Can we write more about the things that matter to us? Can we gather more? So I think there's a lot more you can do we can do within ourselves to actually be heard more. And B, I think it's also about engagement. There's a lot of youth structures out there. Like, for example, a sort of a contextual example from my country where I work up in the mountains. There's a sort of cultural system of having youth groups that look into questions of just social questions of their villages and things like that. So can we engage with them a bit more consciously, both as the youth ourselves, but also as people that might, be part of that landscape as conservationists or just people. So I think recognizing that there might be, so 2 points really. One, that us finding avenues to do more rather than just always saying that we're not included enough. So I think I do believe in beating at that drum, and also acknowledging and engaging with structure that might actually be there. So seeing with the eyes wide open and then engaging.
Caleb?
So I enjoy telling stories, and I think I've learned a bit more about telling better stories from Robin and all the other ones. But I think I speak more for the cultural background from which I am coming. In Africa, well, not all of Africa, where respect is very important, respect for elders is very important, and the older people are mostly right, and even when they are not right, you need to find a nice way. And yet they command so much power that if you think you don't want to do it that way, then it will take you another 10 years to make any impact at all. So in this kind of scenario that I paint, I think that the way I have done it and the way I recommend it is to do what you can and be very good at it till they recognize you and then bring you on board. Most of us young people have not been tested well enough, and it's easy to say and to have ideas, but from yesterday's plenary, we know that it's good to have an idea, but it's also good to have a prototype and then to work it up. So I would say that let's move from having ideas to building our prototype and showing them that this works. And in that case, we are invited onto the table of men, so to speak, where we can really make genuine impact. Thank you.
Elliot.
Well, I think in my role at the Focus on Nature, I see young people across the UK on a very regular basis who are like, or read about them or talk to them, and there really are so many fantastic examples across the breadth of the UK of these sort of 16-year-olds, 20-year-olds who are doing really amazing stuff within the conservation sector and being true conservation leaders. And I think a lot of these people that I'm talking to, because they are doing so much great stuff, they are actually starting to be listened to more than they have historically, I think, potentially. So it's fascinating to see. I think, especially at AFON, we've been given fantastic opportunities to engage with Downing Street. So we've had young people literally going in to talk to Theresa, well, when Theresa May was in power, her environmental advisors and stuff. So obviously young people have a lot of learning to do, have a lot of wisdom to seek, but I do think there is a shift, and I do think if young people really are passionate and really engaged, they can be listened to and be leaders now, and I think we're seeing that.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to have a little discussion which is going to include some miking in the audience perhaps as well, which is about everyone on this panel, and lots of people in the audience come from all over the world, and we'd love there to be regional hubs and more conservation optimism and local action around the world. But obviously, people have different challenges in the different parts of the world that they're from. And we want people to engage with conservation optimism on their own terms. So I'm just interested in a discussion between you and the audience briefly about that. And we don't have any Latin Americans on the panel, and so if there are any Latin Americans in the room, then you're going to get special treatment if you stick your hand up. So how can we make conservation optimism a truly global grassroots movement? Panelists, stick your hand up if you want to say something. Audience, stick your hand up. Latin Americans, stick your hand up. Extra loud. Rod. Latin American, I know, that's all. Yeah. Oh, and there's Nicaragua as well. So, anyway, anyone in the panel want to say something? Anyone in the audience want to say something? We've got Melissa as well. We've got all sorts of people from. Anyone from the panel? Go.
Well, thank you for all your thoughts. Well, I am from El Salvador, so I think for Latin America, it is, and many other countries, it is particularly difficult to present the idea of conservation when you have many other problems that are surrounding you, like poverty, lack of food, violence, and many conflicts. And I would like to know how do you deal with that, and how do you maintain, like, being optimist surrounded in that situation?
Yeah. Has anyone on the panel got something they'd like to say on that? Go on, Nico.
I didn't get the question.
So the question was, given that we're surrounded by conflict and poverty, it's really hard to sell conservation optimism.
So, I mean, that's a really, really hard question. But the way I think of things is, it's not an answer to your question, I guess, but sort of aligned to it. It's more a comment. But I really believe in the power of collaboration. And sometimes we think of that word as this really big thing where, you have to have, I don't know, like all these big things in order for it to happen. But sometimes collaboration is as simple as getting together. It could be just within your community. Like, it baffles me. So as I said, I grew up in Mumbai, but then I worked myself down to Bangalore, which is a city in the south of India, and there's so many NGOs. It's kind of like the Cambridge of India, There's so many NGOs that are based within barely like 5-6 kilometers of each other, right? But it's kind of baffling to see how less we talk to each other. And I think the reason why I say that word is when you do talk to each other, you actually realize so many things are similar, be it positive, negative, issues, potential solutions, or just having someone to talk to. Sometimes, and I learned that from the failure session on the first day, so thank you, Alison, for that. Like, sometimes you don't necessarily need to have solutions, honestly, like, I mean, again, I come from a part of my country which is supremely conflicted, right? On ground, like, and sometimes, like, we've hadn't had solutions for 20 years, 24 years. I mean, I'm 26 years old myself, so I haven't seen solutions on that side of things at all. But sometimes it helps to have someone to talk to, and I think definitely we can do better on that end within our conservation spaces within our countries. I mean, I guess this is a question to the audience. In your context, in your countries, do you think organizations speak to each other enough? Do you think people, okay, maybe organizations don't speak to each other enough because there might be barriers at that level. Do individuals within organizations speak to each other enough? And if the answer is no, let's think why, and can we change that, right? So that's what I would say to that.
Caleb, yeah, go.
Or just, may I pass a quick comment? So I guess your question, if I understand very well, is, I mean, how do you do conservation in such a hostile economic environment? And that's more like my situation, it's just, so I think the key is wanting something strong enough, is conservation a good thing, is saving this a good thing, and do you really want it that bad? And if you want it that bad, then it comes to innovation. How do you get it? And this must be tailored to the local situation, like Robin did with Match.com. Very innovative, and this is how we've done it. I grew up with wildlife. I want to save wildlife, but I mean, how do you save wildlife when people don't have enough to eat? And I'm not talking about people. Me. I don't have enough to eat. Growing up, it's hard, tough times. But you really want to save this, so how do you do it? The way that we have had success in doing this was to find an entry point based on people's belief system, religion, Christianity, Islam, because lots of people are religious in Africa and Latin America, and the Bible and the Quran and the Hadith has a lot to say about conservation and the environment. And we try to integrate our conservation into this message, which, by the way, is very cheap to do. Because people will go to church or go to the mosque anyway. And like that, we've had really huge success at protecting not lions, but frogs.
Great. And Pelf wanted to say something, and then we'll go back to the audience.
Right, Pelf wants to say something. Well, in the many years that I have worked with freshwater turtles in Malaysia, I recently had a breakthrough, and I realized that we want to work with the local communities because they are the ones who are living in the villages. So they are the ones who are indirectly affected by whether these turtles continue to come up to nest or not, because the locals eat the eggs. But this year, beginning 2019, I started a community empowerment project where we involved the local women. So instead of just working with the men, this year we started working with the women, and we are getting them to sow products out of terrapin-free batiks. So in a way, they are also earning side income, pocket money, whatever you call it, and they are working together with us. So I think we cannot expect poor people to care so much about whether the turtles become extinct or not, because it's not their priority. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So to involve the local villagers, to involve more people, we need to we don't need to look at things from their perspective and then take it one step at a time.
Great. Have we got someone else from the audience who'd like to say something on the subject? Max?
Thanks. I think this is a very important issue. Thanks for raising that. Just two issues that I thought I could point out there. I think we risk making a false dichotomy between conservation and poverty. If you look at poor people, especially in Africa, most of their livelihoods are derived from water, forests, fish, and other things from nature that need to be conserved. So conserving those things is actually contributing to their livelihoods. There was a study that we did in India a few years ago that indicated that up to 60% of the GDP of the poor was coming from water, trees, and all those things that we would like to conserve. So by degrading them, we're actually doing poor people a service. So that's number one. Number two, I think we must reject this idea that some governments want to give that conservation is a choice, and poverty and other things are also a choice that they make. Sure, they are choices, but governments are choosing to invest in one and not the other, and we must reject that. You know, by investing in conservation, they are helping poor people. It's just that the elites in society are investing in things that help them, and poor people have no defenders.
So that is a perfect segue to my next question, which is that very few conservationists or people who care about nature seem to become professional politicians, civil servants, work in business, while more and more people seem to be just taking to direct action. You've all chosen, and many of you have chosen, to become professional conservationists, but why? And what career and training would you advise young people to take up if they want to make the biggest difference for nature? And I know Elliot feels passionate about this, so he goes first.
Thank you, Jay. Well, I think everybody in this room would agree that probably the most important job on the planet is trying to save the planet itself. It's probably it's a problem that transcends any problem that has faced humanity in the past. It's going to be massively complex, and we need complete sort of system change and reform to sort of get there. But to go more specifically to the question, I think something I've learned over this, I've had some really good discussions over these 3 days about ingraining conservation in all sectors, all disciplines, to ensure that whatever path somebody takes, they can have some element of conservation thinking in their daily workplace or in their daily way of life. And I think that is fundamentally important for the future of conservation, to ingrain typical conservation and environmental issues into a typical person's way of thinking. But I also think if we are truly going to try and combat the issues that are ahead of us, conservation itself needs to become a more defined, more supported career path, similar to as we see in medicine, similar to as we see in engineering, and so we can really foster young people. In AFON, I see young people all the time who have so much passion and so much knowledge and so much talent, and they really do want to engage in the conservation sector, but there isn't the defined career path that other sectors have. So that's something that for AFON we're trying to do, is try and support that, but we alone can't do that, we're volunteer-led. So I think I chose conservation because I was truly passionate about it, and obviously I'm middle class, I'm white, I'm British, I don't have a lot of the constraints that some people do have, so I still live at home because I work in conservation. These are the sort of sacrifices I had to make, but I was able to make that decision. A lot of people don't. That's why I think we don't see the diversity in conservation. We lose a lot of talent because of that. So I do think conservation does need a reform, and some just saying, and a lot more funding. Hopefully we can see that the awareness that we're seeing rise over the last year, as was said this morning, we can attract more funding, but we do need to really seriously consider the conservation profession as a whole if we really do want to attract people to it, because it can't be, I think it does need to be reformed to some extent.
Does anyone else on the panel have something they'd like? Munib? Yeah. Olya first, yeah, that's fine.
Oh yeah, I guess I agree so much, 100%. There's just some positive twist I could add on that, because studies show that young people, like millennials especially, it's not so much the payment that matters, it's not so much the stable working routine that matters for people when they choose their careers and their jobs. For young people, what matters is the experience and the opportunity to learn and grow. And so this is something that conservation field can give you right now already, even without having this established career path with some defined roles and job opportunities and titles you can apply for. So that's a really great thing for young people because, again, we value a lot more the opportunity to learn, grow, and experience new things. So I guess we should really use that at the moment. And while we are trying to maybe reform the system, how the conservation works as a career, we can really take advantage of the passion of young people and get all the expertise.
Munib?
So I guess this answer is a bit more contextual from India, and I wonder if it will be similar in some of the other countries, and maybe you guys can think about it in your own. It's a point about honesty. I mean, I guess what happens is the golden question you get asked is, like, what do you want to do, and then you have to figure it out. And honestly, it's a journey, right? At least it is for me anyways, where you realize along the way when you get into conservation as this whole big thing that you like certain things and you don't others. And it might so be that along the way you realize that it's really the policy side of things, implementation and all of that, that you really, feel strongly towards. And in India, for instance, then at that level, you can choose to go into the forest services, for instance, which is more sort of the governmental wing, which is very credible. And you can actually be the person signing the papers when it comes to declaring national parks or not, or, making those policy decisions, rather than being, let's say, a scientist outside that in an NGO advocating for it, which is also, you could do that as well, but there you're sort of hoping that you can convince the person to sign the paper. But here, if you sort of be honest with yourself and say, okay, I don't need to get down to do a PhD in an academic institute, but I can actually go into the forest services and do the exam there and become a forester, you might actually be doing something that you actually want to do and not what society makes you feel you want to do. It's a struggle, but I think asking yourself that and really then seeing the options there, and I think there might be other options that you could choose that are more appropriate to what you actually feel like you want to do.
Just going to go to Pelf now. Pelf?
So if you...
sorry. Okay. Right, I think we cannot be pointing fingers at other people without taking real positive actions ourselves. I'm choosing to do this professionally because, number one, I enjoy what I do, and number two, I really want to show young people that they can do conservation without starving themselves. Well, it is a long, hard road, but which career path is easy anyway? So, yeah.
Great. And Taylor?
Well, if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would say that everyone should go to the field and study frogs and, and have fun. But, having gone through the process a little bit, I think a little differently, not very differently now. I think that what people are passionate about, you see that I read somewhere that what you're passionate about can change the world. So instead of asking more people to be field biologists and work with the NGOs, what I'm advocating for is that let us make everybody literate and concerned at a very early age about conservation and the environment and the planet. Let's get that basis very right. And once that is done, let's get them to do what they are passionate about. Let's get them in politics. Let's get them in business. After all, big money and politics is what we're all battling with. So I rather would have that my son or my daughter is as passionate as me and is the president of Ghana. I think that's where the real change will come from.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask a silly question now, which is, if you could be an animal or plant, what would you be and why? This is the end of the conference, so I'm going to ask Pelf first, because we're going to ask the audience after that, and she won't be able to hear. So Pelf, what animal would you be? And if you don't say turtle, then I think everyone else in your NGO will kill you.
You'll be disappointed. Well, you don't have to ask this question. I would want to be a turtle. Why? Because slow and steady wins the race. But wait, I want to be a turtle because they live forever.
Brilliant. Okay, if everyone gets their phones out, then we can go along the panel and to everyone else as well. Yes. No. Okay, so, panellists.
Well, I'll go with hummingbird, not the saiga, no. But yeah, for me it just seems that hummingbird is so representative of the conservationists because they're so tiny and yet they're so strong and there are so many cool facts about them. Like, yeah, like the fact that their heartbeat is more than 10 times faster than ours, and that they consume as much sugar as half of their body weight every time. Crazy, blows your mind. Just read about the facts. Yeah, but like in conservation, in like more metaphorical sense, like we have lots of struggles. We have to constantly be in motion, and sometimes we can feel so small and lonely, kind of, when we have to deal with a crowd of people that have no idea about what kind of things we are trying to push on them. And just like a hummingbird, like we keep moving, we stay in motion, and despite of our size, sometimes we can make great things happen. So, hummingbird for me.
Okay. Elliot.
I think mainly because we share a similar hair colour, I'd go for red squirrel. They're small, I'm small. They like climbing trees, I like climbing trees. But also, as I think the good point you're making now is they work tirelessly, and I think I try and just always working on making small differences, but hopefully if you get lots of squirrels, that's probably lots of acorns collected. So, yeah, red squirrel is what I'd go for.
I'm going to be sneaky and say two of them, because I work in the grassland systems and the mountain systems. So for me, I guess the saiga antelope and the markhor, because for me, both these species really epitomize optimism. You know, for instance, saiga has been clinging on and just surviving it since way before even the mammoths were there, and you know, so that really is amazing. And there's something funny back there. And the markhor as well. I mean, it's found in some really, really hostile environments in Central and South Asia, up in the mountains, in areas that are conflicted as well, but still clinging on. We thought we lost them from Kashmir, but there's 300 remaining somewhere there. So I haven't seen one yet, but it's just beautiful stories and gives you hope and optimism. So both of these.
Credits for taking the saiga as an example.
Yeah. Hello.
Oh,
You can't say frog.
well, if I can't be a frog, because if I can, I would want to be a slippery frog. Slippery frog lives in waterfalls, which is really a fun place to be. The language they speak is whistling. I mean, that would be a cool language to speak. And yeah, I think that their choice of habitat, they always stay in very clean water. So yeah, I think I'd like to be a slippery frog. Thank you.
Brilliant, and thank you all for your wild suggestions about what everyone wants to be. So now I'm going to thank the panellists for a really interesting and inspiring set of questions.
Can I say something very quick?
Thanks to Pelf.